I never thought that bombing at an open mic could lead to anything good. But here I am, still thinking about the guy who was the only one laughing. Seriously, picture this. Me, standing under those dim stage lights, clutching the mic like it was a lifeline, and a room full of strangers staring back at me with that awkward please stop look. I was about to become the punchline of my own jokes, and honestly, it felt brutal. So, there I was, halfway through my set at this little dive bar that hosted open mics every Thursday. I'd been talking myself up all week, convinced that this gig was going to be my big break, or at least a step out of my usual comfort zone. Turns out the only step I took was straight into a giant puddle of silence. My jokes, which sounded hilarious in my head, were landing flat. No laughs, not even polite chuckles. Just the dull hum of the bar and someone occasionally shuffling in their seat. Then, out of nowhere, this guy laughed. Not a quiet, polite laugh that people fake just to be nice. This was a full-on belly laugh. The kind of laugh that makes you look over and think, okay, maybe I'm not completely hopeless. He had this easy smile like he was genuinely enjoying the disaster that was my set. And that laugh, it was kind of contagious because, after a moment, I found myself cracking a small smile too. Even though I was still sweating bullets, I didn't even know his name yet. He was sitting near the back, wearing a simple black jacket and a beanie pulled low over his forehead, a little scruffy but with these sharp eyes that looked like they were always amused by something. I remember thinking that if anyone was going to judge me harshly tonight, it would be him. Instead, he was the only one who gave me any kind of encouragement, even if it was just through laughter. After my set ended, mercifully quick, I slunk down from the stage, ready to disappear into the crowd. But he stood up and came over, still grinning, and said something like, "Hey, that was honestly the best train wreck I've seen in a while. You've got guts." That line broke the tension for me in a way nothing else had. Suddenly, bombing didn't feel like failure anymore. It felt like the start of something. I don't know why, but I wanted to talk to him, to figure out why he was the only guy who laughed, and why, out of all the people in that bar, his laugh mattered the most. So yeah, that's how it started. Me, a failed comedian, and him, the guy with the loud laugh in the quietest room. And honestly, I think that laugh was the best thing that happened to me that night. I was halfway through convincing myself to just say, "Thanks, man," and walk away when he held out his hand. I'm Theo, by the way. That simple introduction kind of knocked me off guard. I wasn't used to anyone approaching me after a set, especially not someone who just basically said my jokes were a disaster. But Theo's grin was genuine, so I shook his hand. "I'm Max," I said, "and yeah, it was a disaster. Not gonna lie." "No, it wasn't," he said, still smiling like he meant it. "You just needed the right audience." I chuckled, a little embarrassed and a little grateful. "Well, you're definitely the right audience, I guess." He nodded, then looked around the bar like he was trying to think of something to say. "So, do you do this often?" "The whole open mic comedy thing, I mean?" "Not really," I admitted. "First time. Thought I'd give it a shot. Figured it'd be fun. Turns out, it's terrifying." Theo laughed again, quieter this time, like he was genuinely amused by the idea of me being terrified on stage. "Yeah, I get that. I'm more of a crowd guy myself, but I respect anyone who gets up there and tries. Takes guts." For some reason, I found myself wanting to tell him more. Maybe it was the way he listened, or how easy it was to talk to him without feeling like I was being judged. So I told him a little about why I decided to try comedy. Said I had always admired comedians who could make people laugh, but I had never had the nerve to do it myself until now. Explained that I liked the idea of putting something personal out there, even if it didn't work. Theo nodded thoughtfully. "It's kind of like dating, don't you think? You put yourself out there, get maybe a few laughs, a few awkward silences, and hope someone doesn't walk away." I laughed. "Yeah, except I'm worse at dating than I am at comedy, so that's saying something." He raised an eyebrow. "Is that so?" "Definitely," I said, shrugging. "Mostly because I'm terrible at reading signals. I'm the guy who thinks a date went well until I get the text that's clearly just polite. Theo smiled in that way that made me feel like he was about to say something smart or funny, but instead he just said, "Well, maybe you just haven't had the right audience yet." There was something about the way he said that, like he was offering a challenge or maybe even hope. I wasn't sure which, but I did know that I wanted to see him again, to find out who he really was beyond that laugh. The bar was starting to thin out, and the next act was getting ready, so Theo said, "Hey, do you want to grab a drink? I'm buying if you promise to try the mic again sometime." I almost said no, mostly because I wasn't sure what to make of him or what this sudden connection meant. But then I realized I didn't want to walk away from this night feeling like it was just a weird blip on my timeline. "Sure," I said. "Why not?" We found a quiet corner of the bar away from the noise of the stage. Theo ordered us 2 beers, and we settled into what felt like an easy conversation, the kind where you lose track of time because you're genuinely interested in what the other person has to say. He told me he worked at a bookstore nearby, and that he was kind of a night owl who liked this particular bar because it was low-key and full of characters, as he put it. I told him a bit about my job, which was pretty mundane, data analyst by day, not so funny comedian by night. At some point, the conversation shifted to music, and I found out he had a decent guitar collection at home. The idea of him playing music was somehow fitting. He seemed like the kind of guy who lived in his own rhythm, unbothered by what the world expected. The more we talked, the more I realized I was actually enjoying myself. And not just because he was funny or kind or had that laugh that stuck with me, it was because he made me feel seen. Like, really seen. Eventually, the bar started to close down, and we stepped outside into the crisp night air. The street was quieter now, and the glow from the neon sign above the bar flickered softly. Theo looked down at me and said, "So, same time next week? You can redeem yourself." I laughed, the nervous excitement bubbling up in my chest. "Yeah, I think I'll take you up on that." He smiled, and I could swear the world felt a little less heavy at that moment. "Good, and maybe this time I'll bring my guitar. We can do a comedy music mashup. Or at least you can be the punchline." I shook my head, grinning. "Deal." As we said goodnight and went our separate ways, I couldn't help but think that maybe bombing at that open mic wasn't the worst thing that happened to me. Because I had met Theo, the guy who laughed when no one else did, and somehow turned my worst night into something I couldn't wait to experience again. The next week, I showed up at the open mic with a mix of excitement and nerves that felt way more intense than it probably should have. I had spent the days between rehearsing new jokes, not because the last set went well, but because Theo's challenge had stuck with me. Redemption felt like a real thing now, like I wasn't stepping up on that stage to humiliate myself again, but to prove, at least to myself, that I could do better. When I walked into the bar, it wasn't super crowded yet, but there was enough of a buzz to make the familiar scent of spilled beer and old wood comforting rather than overwhelming. I scanned the room and spotted Theo almost immediately. He was sitting at the same spot near the back, that black jacket and beanie still there, though now I noticed a little worn patch on the elbow of the jacket that made him look even more real, like someone who didn't care about pretending to be perfect. He caught my eye and gave me a thumbs up with a smile that made my stomach do that awkward, nervous flip. I walked over, and before I could say anything, he said, "Ready to blow them away this time?" I laughed. I'm definitely ready to try not to blow myself up. We spent a few minutes just talking and joking around while the other performers went up on stage. Theo's presence was comforting, like having a quiet anchor in the chaos of my nerves. When it was finally my turn, I grabbed the mic and took a deep breath. This time the jokes landed better. Not perfect, but better. There were laughs, not just from Theo, but a few people scattered through the crowd. And when I glanced back to the corner, Theo was clapping, that easy smile on his face, like he was my biggest fan. Hell, he probably was. After my set, I went straight to him, feeling like I'd just survived a storm with a little more dignity. He pulled me into a quick side hug and said, "See, told you you had it." "Thanks for believing in me," I said quietly. "No one else did, huh?" he teased, but there was a softness in his eyes that made me think he really meant it. We ended up hanging out after the bar closed, sitting on the curb outside while the city lights blinked around us in the early hours. It was one of those moments where the world feels paused, like everything that happened and everything about to happen doesn't matter as much as this exact second. I don't usually come to these things, Theo said, twisting the ring on his finger absent-mindedly, but you made it worth it. That caught me off guard. Why? Because I'm hilarious? He laughed, then shook his head. No, because you're not trying to be someone you're not. Most people get up there and fake it, but you're just you. It's refreshing. I wasn't sure what to say to that, so I just smiled. I liked that he saw me. All the awkward, fumbling parts that usually got buried. We talked about other stuff too, books we loved, terrible movies we secretly enjoyed, the kind of music that made us feel like we weren't alone. It felt natural, like we'd known each other longer than a few hours. At some point, I noticed the way the streetlights caught the gold flecks in his eyes, how his smile softened when he looked at me, and I realized I was already way too invested in this guy. So, I said, breaking the comfortable silence, "What's the deal with the guitar?" He grinned and pulled out his phone to show me pictures of a beat-up acoustic he had at home. I play a bit. Nothing fancy, but it's my thing. Thought maybe next time we could do that mashup? Comedy and music. I nodded eagerly. I'm down for that. Though I might mostly be the punchline. Yeah, he said. But sometimes the punchline is the best part. I liked the way he said that. Like he knew something I didn't. We ended the night exchanging numbers, and I left with a feeling that maybe, just maybe, bombing on that stage wasn't a failure at all. It was the start of something I hadn't expected, but desperately wanted. Over the next few weeks, we kept meeting, sometimes at the bar, sometimes for coffee, sometimes just wandering the city talking about everything and nothing. Theo was easy to be around, and I found myself looking forward to his texts, his laughter, the way he listened without judgment. One night, he invited me over to his place after a show. I was nervous, not just because it was the first time I'd been invited somewhere like that, but because it felt like something was definitely shifting between us. His apartment was cozy, filled with books stacked in messy piles and posters with faded edges. The guitar sat in the corner. Just like he said, he handed me a beer and sat down next to me on the couch. "So ready for this mashup?" "Absolutely," I said, trying to sound casual but feeling my heart race. He grabbed his guitar and started strumming a few chords softly. Then he looked over at me and said, "Okay, you do the jokes, I'll do the music." I cleared my throat, feeling the familiar jitters, but this time, it was different. Theo was here, actually paying attention, laughing with me, not at me. And maybe that was the secret all along, that it wasn't about being perfect or having the perfect set, but about finding someone who would laugh with you, even when you're falling apart. As I told a joke and he played along with the riff, I realized I was exactly where I was supposed to be. That night, after our little comedy music mashup, something shifted between us. It wasn't like the cliché romantic movie moment where the lights dim and everything becomes magical. No, it was quieter, softer, like when two people start to realize maybe they're less like strangers and more like something worth holding on to. Theo put the guitar down and stretched his fingers, eyes still bright from playing. "You know, you've got a weird kind of charm when you're nervous on stage. Like, it's part of the act." I snorted a laugh. "Weird charm? That's a new one." "Hey, I didn't say it was normal." He shrugged, grinning. I caught myself watching him for a beat longer than I probably should have. But the way he smiled, honest and unguarded, made it easy. Suddenly, the idea of this being just a casual hangout felt a little more complicated. Like the space between us was suddenly charged. "I'm glad you came over," I said without really thinking. Theo looked at me, that grin fading into something softer. "Me too." We didn't say much more after that, but the silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of quiet that fills up a room without pressure, like everything was already understood. That night, I walked home with my heart pounding, replaying every little moment. The way he'd looked at me when I'd fumbled a punchline, the way his fingers had moved over the strings like they knew exactly what to do, the easy way he sat beside me like he wasn't afraid to be close. The next few days, I caught myself texting him more than usual. Small stuff. Asking about his day, sending dumb jokes I'd thought of, sharing songs I liked. And, surprisingly, he replied with the same kind of enthusiasm. even sending me playlists with titles like For the Failed Comedian and Laugh It Off. One Thursday, when open mic night came around again, Theo showed up with a surprise. He handed me a small folded piece of paper before he went up to the bar. "What's this?" I asked, unfolding it. "Just some notes," he said, shrugging. "For your set. Think of it as a cheat sheet from your biggest fan." I glanced down and saw a few joke ideas, some silly riffs, and at the bottom, written in messy handwriting, "You're better than you think." Seriously, I blinked, the words hitting me harder than I expected. "Thanks, man," he winked. "No problem. Now go kill it up there." When I got on stage that night, something felt different. I wasn't just telling jokes. I was sharing pieces of myself, with Theo's laugh waiting for me in the crowd. The room was warmer, the light less harsh, and the silence less intimidating because I knew he was there, rooting for me no matter what. After my set, we met up outside, and he pulled me close, fingers brushing against my arm. "You did great," he whispered. I smiled, my nerves melting into something softer, something like hope. "Come on," he said, taking my hand. "Let's get out of here." We wandered the city streets, the night cool and quiet. We talked about everything and nothing, the kind of easy, endless conversation that makes you forget where you are and just exist in the moment. At one point, we stopped by a small park, sitting on a bench beneath a street lamp that cast a warm glow. Theo leaned into me, his head resting lightly on my shoulder. "Ever think about how weird it is that we met because I laughed at your disaster of a set?" he murmured. I laughed softly. "Yeah." I thought it was pretty ironic, but maybe it was exactly what we needed, he said, voice low. I looked at him then, really looked, and something inside me clicked. I reached up, tucking a stray lock of hair behind his ear, feeling the slight shiver that went through him. "Maybe it was," I said. There was a pause, and then he turned to face me, eyes searching mine. "Max," he said quietly, "I don't do this often, you know? Letting someone in. Neither do I admitted. He smiled, that slow, genuine smile that made my chest feel tight and full at the same time. "Then let's make a deal," he said, "to keep laughing together, no matter what, because I think you're worth it." I grinned, the words feeling like warm sunlight on a cold day. Deal. And just like that, what started as the worst open mic set of my life had become the most unexpected beginning of something real. Something that wasn't about perfection or getting the biggest laughs. It was about finding someone who saw you, laughed with you, and maybe, just maybe, wanted to stick around. After that night in the park, things between us felt different. Like the quiet promise we made was a seed starting to grow. It wasn't dramatic or sudden, but there was this steady, slow-burning warmth each time we hung out, like a fire that didn't need to roar to be felt. We kept meeting up almost every week, usually around open mic night, but sometimes just grabbing coffee or wandering through the city with no real plan. Theo had this way of making even the most mundane things feel alive. Like the time we got caught in a sudden rainstorm walking home, and instead of running, we just stood there laughing as the water soaked through our clothes. I remember thinking, I don't usually like rain, but I wouldn't trade this moment for anything. One evening, a few weeks after that, we ended up at his place again. He was strumming his guitar softly in the living room, and I was sprawled out on the couch, half listening, half lost in thought. The room smelled like old books and something that was unmistakably Theo, earthy with a hint of peppermint. He looked up from his guitar and said, "You know, I never thought I'd like having someone around who's kind of a mess on stage." I laughed. "Is that your polite way of saying I'm a disaster?" "Maybe," he said with a smirk. "But a lovable disaster." I rolled my eyes but couldn't stop the grin. "I'll take it." He paused, fingers resting on the strings, and then said something unexpected. "You ever think about how much we hide, like how much of ourselves we keep tucked away because we're scared of being judged?" I nodded because, yeah, I thought about that a lot, especially when it came to stuff like dating or even just being openly me. "I used to be scared," he continued, "afraid that if people saw the real me, they'd run. But then I realized the right people won't. They'll laugh at your jokes even when they're bad. They'll stay when it's messy." I looked at him, heart tightening. "That sounds a lot like what you did for me." He smiled softly. Maybe we're good at finding the messes worth sticking around for. There was something so raw and honest in that moment that I felt this urge to close the small distance between us. So I did, leaning in until our foreheads touched, that quiet electricity buzzing between us. When I finally pulled back, I whispered, "I'm glad I found you, Theo." He reached out, his hand warm on my cheek. "Me too, Max. Me too." That night, we fell asleep tangled up on his couch, the kind of closeness that felt like coming home after a long journey. Things weren't perfect. I still stumbled over my words on stage, and Theo had his own set of worries he didn't always share. But we had something real. Something that wasn't about impressing the crowd or hiding our flaws. It was about being seen, being accepted, and most importantly, being wanted. One weekend, he invited me to a small gathering at his place, just a few friends from the bookstore and the bar. I was nervous. Not because I didn't want to meet them, but because I wasn't sure how to fit into his world. But as soon as I walked in, the room welcomed me like I belonged. His friends were warm and easygoing, and before long, I was laughing and joking like I'd known them forever. Theo watched me with this quiet pride that made me feel like the luckiest guy alive. Later that night, when everyone had left, we sat on the balcony, the city lights stretching out beneath us. "I'm glad you came tonight," Theo said, wrapping an arm around my shoulders. "Me too," I said, leaning into him. "You've made me feel like I can be more than just the guy who bombs on stage." He kissed the top of my head. "You're so much more than that. And I'm not going anywhere." In that moment, I realized how much I'd been holding back, how much I'd been waiting for someone to laugh with me, not at me, to see me without any filters. Theo was that person, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like maybe I was exactly where I was supposed to be. We settled into a kind of rhythm after that night. It wasn't anything flashy, just the two of us carving out space in each other's lives, slowly and without pressure. Theo still worked at the bookstore during the day, and I kept my data analyst job, but the moments in between, the texts, the late-night phone calls, the random coffee dates, started to feel like the real parts of my day. One afternoon, a couple of weeks later, he surprised me by showing up at my office. I was buried under spreadsheets and barely hanging onto my sanity when there was a knock on the glass door. I looked up and almost didn't believe it. There was Theo, with that familiar grin and a takeout coffee in hand. "Thought you could use a break," he said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. I laughed, feeling instantly lighter. "You're a lifesaver." We spent 10 minutes in the little break room, sipping coffee and talking about everything but work. He pulled out his phone and showed me a photo of a cat that looked like it had just had a 7-day week. "That's Morty," he said, "my bookstore's unofficial mascot. He's basically the boss." I smiled, imagining this scruffy cat ruling the dusty aisles. "Sounds like my kind of management." He laughed, and for a moment, just watching him laugh made the office feel less claustrophobic. After that, Theo started dropping by more often, sometimes with coffee, sometimes just to say hi. The people I worked with started to notice, and honestly, I didn't care. The thing was, having him around made the day brighter, even when the numbers and charts threatened to bury me. One Thursday came around, open mic night again, and this time, Theo wasn't just in the audience. He was up on stage with me. We'd been rehearsing that comedy music mashup, and tonight was the night we'd try it live. I won't lie, my heart was pounding in a way that had nothing to do with nerves and everything to do with anticipation. Standing there next to Theo, holding the mic, watching him strum the opening chords on his guitar, it felt like we were saying something without words, like our own little secret performance for the world. We started with a joke about bad dates, Theo chiming in with a cheeky riff whenever I landed a punchline. The crowd was warmer tonight. Laughs came easier, smiles spread wider. I glanced over at Theo, who was grinning like a kid who just got the best present ever. Midway through the set, I stumbled on a line and froze for a second. But instead of panic, I felt his hand briefly touch mine, a quick squeeze that grounded me. I smiled and kept going, and the room erupted in laughter. After we finished, the applause felt like validation, not just for the set, but for us, for this thing we'd built together out of awkward starts and unexpected laughs. Later, outside the bar, Theo pulled me close, his breath warm against my ear. "You were amazing." I leaned into him, feeling the steady beat of his heart. We were amazing. He kissed me then, slow and sure, like he was marking this moment as something important. It wasn't flashy or dramatic, just two people holding onto each other in the middle of a noisy world. The weeks that followed brought more moments like that. Lazy Sunday mornings where we made pancakes and debated over the right amount of syrup. Nights where we'd binge-watch terrible movies and laugh until our sides hurt. And quiet evenings where we talked about our pasts, the messy bits, the regrets, the hopes. One night, we were sitting on Theo's couch, the glow of the city skyline painting the room in blues and golds. I was nervously fiddling with the hem of my shirt, and he caught the look, tilting his head. "What's on your mind?" I hesitated, then said, "I keep thinking about how scary it is to let someone in, and how lucky I am that it's you." Theo smiled, his eyes soft and steady. "I'm not going anywhere, Max. You can trust me." Feeling bold, I reached for his hand. "I want this to be something real, not just the fun nights or the laughs, but everything, the good and the messy." He squeezed my hand gently. "Me too. We'll figure it out together." That felt like the moment everything shifted from possibility to promise. It wasn't perfect. There were still days when doubt crept in, when I worried I'd mess up, or when Theo had his own battles. But we faced those days side by side, the same way we faced the stage, sometimes stumbling, sometimes shining, but always together. Looking back, it's funny to think it all started with that one laugh. The laugh that wasn't about mockery, but about connection. The laugh that told me maybe there was someone out there who'd see me, all my awkwardness and all, and still want to be close. Sometimes life's best beginnings come from the most unexpected places. For me, it was a dive bar, a failed comedy set, and the guy who decided to laugh anyway. And honestly, I wouldn't change a thing. A few months after that open mic night, where Theo and I finally performed together, I found myself sitting on the same park bench where we'd first talked about the messes worth sticking around for. The city was quiet around us, the kind of peaceful night that lets you breathe easier. Theo was beside me, his hand warm in mine, fingers intertwined like they'd always belonged there. We didn't say much. There wasn't a need. The silence between us felt comfortable, like an old song you didn't have to explain. I looked over at him and caught the way his eyes softened in the streetlight's glow. "You know," I said, "I never thought bombing on stage would lead me here." He laughed softly. "Neither did I, but I'm glad it did." I squeezed his hand, feeling the weight of all the nights we'd spent laughing, messing up, and learning to be real with each other. It wasn't always easy, and we'd stumbled plenty of times trying to find our way. But with Theo, it had felt worth it. Every awkward joke, every nervous moment, every shared secret. "Thanks for being the guy who laughed when no one else did," I said quietly. He smiled, that quiet, knowing smile that always made me feel seen. "And thanks for being the guy worth laughing with." We leaned in together, the world shrinking until it was just us, two people who'd found something honest and steady in the middle of a chaotic city. No grand declarations, no fireworks, just a simple, beautiful moment of connection. As we pulled back, I realized that what we had wasn't about perfection or the spotlight. It was about understanding and acceptance, about being willing to stand beside someone even when the jokes fall flat or life gets messy. And in that, I found something I hadn't dared hope for before, a quiet kind of happiness. Maybe it all started with a laugh, but it ended with something much deeper, a feeling that I was finally home.